Hello and welcome to today's GovFocus. I'm Sylvia Oakland, a staff writer here at GovCIO Media and Research. Application Programming Interfaces, or APIs, have become a growing target for cyber threats, even as agencies rely on them to accelerate digital modernization and expand their data sharing. Zero Trust strategies are essential to securing APIs across cloud, edge, and hybrid environments. And today we're going to be talking about what makes APIs difficult to secure. We'll examine some technical approaches within Zero Trust architecture and identify some practical next steps that can maintain mission requirements and still enable interoperability. On the show, I'm joined by Robert Costello, CIO at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, Keith Busby, Acting CISO at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, and Brian Dennis, Principal Technologist of the Public Sector at Akamai Technologies. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's just get started with the big picture. What makes APIs challenging to secure, and how does Zero Trust address those challenges? Bob, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Sylvia. Great to be here today. I think Zero Trust applies across all of our platforms and work. So when you look at CISA's Zero Trust maturity model, there's some great background there for people that maybe don't understand what we're talking about when we say Zero Trust. But really, it means authenticating every user, every action, every device, everything that occurs across your network constantly, also assuming that we've already been breached, that the adversary is already operating within our environments. I think what makes APIs sometimes a little bit more difficult is they're typically on the developer end. The developer is trying to get things done. They're trying to move very fast. They may not always know the best procedures to secure an API. And then furthermore, sometimes you might have another group that's saying, well, we need to share this data. We need to get this connection up and running very fast. So I think what we are trying to shift the mindset a bit is Zero Trust is not just about the users anymore. It's about everything that occurs in our environment, the endpoints that we work on, and the API endpoints that we create. And then it's fundamental to understand that when you publish an API, oftentimes we see people publish them publicly or share keys in a manner that jeopardizes the security of those keys. They're shared in a way that the adversary could then get the API key and then exploit it very quickly.
Thank you. And Keith, I'd love to hear your perspective on what makes these APIs challenging to secure and how Zero Trust kind of can help that.
Thanks, Sylvia. Yeah. So the what's interesting about APIs around Zero Trust for me is right. It's a never-ending expanding attack surface, right? Especially as we modernize our systems. And traditionally, we would look at this as kind of endpoint connections, and it's no longer really about that. This is another machine to machine connection, but it is still a user-centric kind of identity thing. So we are looking at these more from an identity perspective where we need to do continuous verification of the endpoints connecting, right? It's no longer a north-south connection from a user coming into the environment. It's more of a lateral movement, east-west, machine talking to machine, but it's how we can verify continuously that those machines are connecting the right way, getting the right data repeatedly.
And Brian?
Yeah, and so as Keith just said, we have this huge landscape of APIs that we're working with right now, and that landscape is completely fragmented. APIs have been around for a long time. This is not a new creation, and so what we're seeing is that the visibility of those APIs is becoming a major issue. Often, a lot of organizations might have hundreds or even thousands of APIs across different environments that were built by different teams using different technologies, even legacy technologies. And most of those are undocumented, maybe unmanaged, or even forgotten, sometimes what we call shadow APIs. And it creates blind spots in this coverage. And so what we have is a visibility issue. And so what Zero Trust really helps to do is for the first time, it helps us map out what this landscape looks like. So we're no longer kind of stumbling in the dark. We really have a good idea of what's going on in this API landscape and what we can do to better protect ourselves and to make sure that those shadow APIs that are hanging out in the background aren't that really easy doorway in for the attackers that are coming after us.
And I'd love to stick with this theme of legacy systems. There are just so many different disparate systems, across the federal government. And so, Keith, how are you addressing that challenge of securing these legacy systems and these APIs that, especially with these legacy systems, maybe weren't designed with zero trust in mind?
We're still layering in some of the traditional approaches around microsegmentation, trying to transition to more of a key management perspective for these interconnections, right? Switching it to building out APIs where we need to, moving away from those direct persistent connections into a more continuous, right, repeatable fashion.
Keith just brought up a good point. Like sometimes we are still using those legacy approaches. I think it's very important. We get back to kind of inventory management. A lot of places don't know all the APIs in use. So you go back to the things that we've been doing for many years in the federal government. You need to know your inventory, what's operating on your environment, who's operating on your environment. And these are machine-to-machine connections, which traditionally for a long period of time, and I think still continues. That was often development teams talking to other development teams, making these connections happen. So I think it's very important that your CISO's office has very good visibility into what's occurring in the environment, that we have an inventory of what's going on, and then you go back to the essentials of least privilege. Can that API and the calls it's making only access the data that it should at the point in time that it should? And then going back to what's been mentioned here too, continuous authorization, authentication, are the entitlements right? And are we monitoring it? Are we auditing it? Does it still need to exist? Is it still using technologies that it should? Because often we have modern systems connecting to legacy systems, and that can create some very interesting dynamics. And then sometimes you still have to go back to the things we've done for many years in networks proxying, where we're inspecting data, that can still occur in this environment. So things like API gateways play a very critical role to make sure that management is done correctly.
It really goes back to what's old is new again concept for us, especially in the private sector. Years ago, a lot of people started trying to really build segmentation programs to really ensure the safety of their networks. And what we found was that segmentation was hard. It was difficult to build out. On average, it took about 2 years to get done. More often than not, it really ended up becoming shelfware. It just never went anywhere. So a lot of organizations thought it was a good idea, but how could we make it better? And so what we're doing right now is focusing on micro segmentation. So using agent-based software segmentation to really go in and put these fences around these old legacy systems that have no software support, that have no security support left anywhere, and really build a fence just that protects them and shields them from any attack coming in. And so if that legacy system still has to be used, which in a lot of situations it does, we can make sure that the APIs that are connecting to it and all this information that's getting sent back and forth is protected as much as possible. And so that east to west lateral movement is safe and secure within our networks. And so that helps us build this visibility out so we understand what we're looking at when we're looking at our networks, which has not happened in the last few years. And we really have to get better about it now, knowing that legacy systems and APIs are really a leading cause of us being breached these days.
Bob, I'd like to bring it back to you for a moment just because CISA released the BOD 2602. And so that requires agencies to remove their end of support edge devices, talking about all of these different devices and systems that we have to connect. How does edge device management kind of intersect with API security within someone's zero trust strategy?
Well, I think Binding Operational Directive 2602 was the culmination of many months and years of work where we have identified it as that one of the most common vectors that the adversary is getting into federal networks is through edge devices. And by an edge device, we mean something like a router, potentially switches, VPN devices, anything that kind of touches the internet. So what we were really aiming for with 2602 is helping the federal government buy down risk and identify these devices that no longer have software support, no longer have hardware support, don't have vendor security patching occurring. And then what we also want to tie back to is zero trust solutions for things like remote access or things that have to interface with the internet. So yeah, we really want to push the federal government to secure access service edge, which is something that we describe through our zero trust working groups and on CIS's webpage on our maturity model. 2602 is geared towards replacing end of life and end of support edge devices within the federal civilian and executive branch. However, it does give really great guidance to state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. And we're trying to modernize in a way that reduces the attack surface or moves where the adversary can attack us. So right now, these devices present really an unacceptable and sometimes unmitigatable risk because they're no longer receiving any sort of vendor support.
As a security professional, I'm a little disappointed that you even had to release this pod, right? It's really standard practice at this point, right? That we should be removing end of life, end of supported appliances no matter what, and they definitely shouldn't be on the edge. Similar to the BOD directing for unmanaged admin access being exposed to the public internet. We shouldn't have admin interfaces exposed to the public. It's just creating an additional risk for these for all of these entities, and we continue to see breaches occurring from them.
Well, I think sure we can definitely agree on that, but it's very important and part of CIS's mission is to release information that is consumable by many different groups.
Yeah.
There are a lot of communities in critical infrastructure and SLTT that don't necessarily have the resources, like their cybersecurity professional might also be the town select person and the mayor and all these other things. In some cases, an enforcement methodology for us to ensure that the federal government is adhering to good practices and that CIOs, CISOs, and CFOs in the federal government are empowered to make the right decisions. Because often these systems, whether they're legacy or elsewhere, are funded at an operations and maintenance or operations and sustainment standard. But you have to make executive decisions between the CIO and the CFO to say, we're going to do X Vice maybe work on the backlog of user requirements right now. So they do serve multi purposes. I think we are also, there's an educational element. You can read a lot of these and understand them. They're not 50 pages of security recommendations to describe what we want to do. And they can be, while they're only binding to the federal government, they can serve a purpose for all our partners that CISA works with.
Completely agree with the need. It just breaks my professional heart a little bit.
I work with both the federal government and our state and local side. And I see that, the cybersecurity landscape, when we talk about the labor force right now, it's very thin. And, all of these organizations are trying to find people who have the background and the know-how to do this work, but that doesn't necessarily exist. And we're working really hard to ramp up education and to get people certified and understanding what this job entails. But for a lot of people, like Bob said, it might be one person who wears multiple hats running an organization's security, and information coming out from CISA really helps them to understand, oh yeah, that is something I really need to think about, and this can actually help me protect myself. And so, yeah, like Keith said, it stinks that we still have to deal with this these days, but anything we can do to act as that leadership organization to really help push through is great. I think it's well worth it.
We are increasingly learning that this all kind of comes back to data for our cybersecurity. And Keith, over at HHS, there's a really big push for open data. I mean, last year we saw the release of the HHS open data strategy and the open data website. So, how do you go about balancing that mandate for this open data exchange while also, again, really focusing on these zero trust security principles that are so integral?
For CMS, while open data is incredibly important and there's definitely a need for it, the first priority for us is privacy, right? We are entrusted with the sensitive information of up to like 160 million Americans, right? 160 American or 160 million people's sensitive information, their PHI, their health records, all of this information is trusted to us. And so, yes, we want to share for research purposes, for interoperability purposes, for public health information, but we still need to make sure that we are doing what we can to protect all of that information. So our approach, right, and my approach is security is an enabler, not a barrier, right? So we want to ensure that you are the business side of sharing that data can do it. We just layer in some additional controls, some different asks, and maybe a little yes and yes, do this and please do this, this, and this with that to ensure that we're not risking that trust that we've been granted from the American public.
And as we're going through this, agencies are looking to update their data strategies, they're modernizing their systems, they're modernizing that data. There's just a lot of moving parts and pieces that are going on here. So, Brian, what are some really high impact but first steps that agencies can kind of take as they're starting to understand how APIs and zero trust can work together?
When an organization really starts down this path, the first thing that they need to start thinking about is, and I use this constantly, but it is true, visibility. You can't secure what you don't know exists. I mean, that's a major problem that we're dealing with right now. And so organizations really need to start finding out what APIs are roaming around within their systems and build an inventory across all of their environments to identify any of those shadow APIs that are hanging around, any of those legacy endpoints that could potentially be a problem, and anything that is undocumented within the system. And so this will help you understand what your attack surface looks like and what you can do to begin mitigating some of these major areas of concern. Additionally, start thinking about what you can do to deploy policy enforcement. A lot of organizations might not have any policy enforcement in place when it comes to these APIs. And what can you do to build a centralized authentication process and put in rate limiting and enforcement throughout the entire gateway? And so this creates a consistent control point for applying zero trust across all of your backend services. And so for any organization that's really starting down this pathway, that's what we suggest. And at Akamai, when we're working with groups, more often than not, and I think the average for us is about 56% of the organizations that we're working with, 56% of the APIs that they believe are out there, it's almost double. And so we see organizations that say, oh, we only have about 400 APIs and then, roaming around. They usually have about 800. And so it's because of this that we have to build this visibility and this understanding of what's happening within our systems.
Yeah, and Bob and Keith, I'd love to pose kind of the mirror of that question of what are some next steps that you would like to see from industry partners on this?
Well, I first I'd like to hammer home what Keith really kind of described, and that is like if you are not a good partner to the mission side and understand their business needs, what they're trying to do, they'll go do it themselves and they'll go rogue. So I really liked that because that's what we try and do. In my office, sometimes I'd like to say we get it more often right than wrong. But it is a partnership, and it doesn't work if the security organization or the CIO's organization doesn't become a business enabler to the mission side. So I loved what he was talking about there. And I think also it's critical that we have a good partnership with our chief privacy officers. Like I talk to our privacy officer probably many times a week, certainly as we're working through things to make sure that we're compliant and protecting people's personal information, or just the overall remit that CPOs have in the government to protect data. I think on industry, what I am thrilled with here at CISA, I do kind of wear a couple hats right now, so I get to be part of the leadership team of the cybersecurity division. We have great industry partnership. The Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, that's a great way for industry to share information with CISA. We were thrilled that CISA 2015 was renewed through the end of the fiscal year. Of course, we would like a long-term authorization for it, but that is extremely helpful for sharing information with CISA and the protections that it provides. So we are always interested in companies that want to join the JCDC or work with CISA on a program for the things that we are pushing out through either our FSEB work or our critical infrastructure work.
From an engagement standpoint, it's interesting. CMS, we are a large entity, right? And so HHS as a whole, we've over the last couple of years have been working really to engage with the external healthcare world, right? So we saw issues, whether it was the Change Healthcare, the Ascension Healthcare, all of these various attacks that have happened over the last couple of years. We've realized that we need to proactively get involved with them. And this can only happen through greater, data sharing kind of agreements, right? Whether it's from a security standpoint, whether it's threat intel, Brian had mentioned visibility, whether it's visibility into indications of compromise or threat intel or whatever we are seeing. I'd really love to get to the point where we can more streamline share that with the public sector so that they're aware of the same information that we are. I know CISA has some offerings and some programs to release some amount of information, but there's still some things that are restricted that I think would benefit the overall community so that we can find ways to kind of come together and grow as a whole.
And looking ahead to 2026 and 2027, and honestly beyond, what are some emerging trends that you think are going to impact how we need to evolve our zero trust strategies for the increase of APIs? And Keith, I'd love to stick with you, please.
2026 and the end of 2025, I think, are starting to show a trend in attack vectors for organizations that are still rarely looked at, and this is software supply chain. So we're continuing to see all these third-party libraries that get compromised through a speed of updates, which we want to see, right? Rapid iteration of product, rapid iteration of code development. The problem is that we still don't have a great way of understanding what type of risk and what type of leverage we use as organizations on these third-party libraries. I think there's still a gap in runtime validation, knowing what risk we are at, right? There's not great technology out there that's easily implementable to determine where our risk is at from a run standpoint. I'm hoping that over time we can shift more towards a policy as code methodology to help us reinforce some controls around all this third-party risk that we're incurring. So it's a little bit different than pure zero trust, right? Because it's not necessarily user-centric, but it's still that the API-driven nature of the code that's running underneath and how we're leveraging it. And that's a risk that I think we're just going to continue to see get exploited as we move into 2026 and 2027.
Looking ahead, thinking about where we are, the theme really is that zero trust API security, it has to become more intelligent right now. It needs to be more distributed and more adaptive with every organization. And so the strategies that we've built in the past that work for APIs, when we were really thinking centralized and really thinking just specifically data centers, doesn't work anymore. Every organization has some type of hybrid environment where they have on-prem or cloud environments working together. And so everything has grown so massively and so quickly that it's really hard to try to get everything done at once. And specifically working at speeds that we never imagined we'd be able to get to. And so the organizations that we're going to see succeeding in this year will be those that can verify trust continuously, really thinking about how do I make sure that the APIs that are speaking to one another or any information that's coming in is verified, and automatically increasing complex and distributed systems across their entire network. And so this comes with working towards building enforcement policies that work for you and your organization, really mapping out and building a guide and that landscape, that visibility of what APIs are really working within your network right now, and which ones you can potentially get rid of, or potentially, ring fence around or segment around, so that that information doesn't go anywhere else laterally within your network. And just that's where we're going to get to. And I think Keith making the comment about supply chain is very important. I mean, that supply chain that we're dealing with right now, it could potentially be a hazard in the future. And so thinking about where the API attacks are coming from, in the last year, Akamai sees about 33% of the internet traffic every day. And so we're understanding these API attacks and how fast they're growing. Thousands of percent increase in API attacks over the last year, and that's only going to continue. And so this is where we really have to, buckle down and think more intelligently about the security process and that communication issue.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the supply chain attacks. I mean, we just saw one recently with the commonly used Notepad++. That there's some great articles out on the internet on the adversary that did compromise it, how it happened. I think we see more and more of that, and then often what we still see is kind of that sprawl across your environment, different versions being used. One team, wants to use this very particular version of something because it's what they like, and then it doesn't get updated, or we're dealing with, just the inventory problem that I think we've all kind of talked about here. It's hard to kind of see the future. Certainly 2027 feels further out, than I ever thought I'd be dealing with. But I think the speed of attacks, the volume of attacks, they are not going to go down. And we're definitely seeing, through the adoption of AI, the attackers are using that to understand environments, to conduct attacks, and then we have to readjust our workforce to start using AI internally to do things faster, conduct reviews faster, and also it's changing the workforce a little bit. There are not enough IT and cyber professionals to do all the work. I think we agree with that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have backlogs in our development cycles or in our work. So I think, finding the best way to retrain the entire workforce, not just the IT workforce, on the usage of AI, and then also just adjusting our internal processes. The same tools and procedures we used for the last 5 years will not be the same that we use for the next 5 years going forward.
Thank you. There's still so much work to be done, but today we've talked about a lot of things that have made progress, and we've learned that APIs are difficult to secure. We've talked about some of those basics of zero trust and how they can really enable secure APIs. And of course, we look to the future for some of those trends that we may be seeing. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. We really appreciate your insight.